Missing children is a sad reality that we have to deal with on a daily basis. And when it happens, the whole community gathers together to try and return them safely. But more often than not, they aren't found. When an 18-year-old girl went missing, the Riverwood community put in their best efforts to find her, but her case went unsolved until a man named Dermot stumbled upon an unusual sight during one of his hikes. So, what did he find, and what happened to the girl? Dermot loves hiking and being outdoors. He can't get enough of the cold wind blowing through his hair, the smell of the pine trees surrounding him, and the dirt beneath his feet. He spends most of his free time in nature. But when he got dressed this particular Sunday morning in December and headed out to the forest for his usual hike, Dermot couldn't have prepared for what he would find. Dermot lived in a small town named Riverwood. Everyone knew everyone, and they all tried to help each other out when they needed a hand. However, just 7 months before Dermot's Sunday morning hike, a tragedy struck the small town of Riverwood that changed them forever and kept them on guard. The people of the town couldn't get what happened out of their minds. A girl named Alice went to visit a friend on her street, and she disappeared. All that was found from the 18-year-old girl was her pink bicycle. Naturally, Alice's parents were a mess. The girl wouldn't go anywhere without asking them first. Did she get lost on her way home? Before long, the whole town found out about the missing teenage girl, and they did what they could to help. But there was still no sign of Alice. 100 residents of the town came to help search for the girl, and Dermot was one of the volunteers. They arrived outside the missing girl's house with the police accompanying them. The residents were in for a long night, but they were prepared. They prayed that she was okay, and they were willing to do whatever it took to bring Alice home. They were ready to search for hours if it meant finding her. The 100 residents walked down every road and crossed through every field of the small town, calling out one thing: Alice. 100 people called out their girl's name without any response. Dermot grew more anxious with each passing moment. He could feel his stomach in knots. Still, there was no sign of the missing girl and no evidence as to what happened to her. Even still, the community was hopeful she would be found. It was stressful and emotional. We were all out there just walking back and forth from one end to the other, yelling her name, Alice's best friend Jan recalled. And as more time passed, the community started feeling discouraged. The search was now nothing more than a group of people, disorganized and stumbling into each other while calling out Alice's name. There was still no answer as to what happened to Alice. By day 7, most of the volunteers from the community left, and fewer flashlights were shining at night. People started to give up, and those who stayed were having a hard time continuing the search for the missing girl. She could be anywhere, in the woods, in the fields, or in a place no one would have expected. Day after day, the search came up empty, and then they heard a sound of chopping in the distance. The sounds caught the volunteers off guard, and a week had already passed. It was time to bring in the police. In the air, police helicopters combed the woods with infrared cameras, and on the ground, units with dogs searched for any clues. But even with all the help, there was still no sign of Alice. Days turned into weeks, and still, no one had heard from the missing girl. What happened to her? And were they too late? Dermot wasn't willing to give up on Alice yet. The news of the missing girl hit him hard, and he was determined to help out in any way he could. So, he continued his search into the night for the girl. He searched for Alice in the woods. Night after night, Dermot looked for Alice, but he couldn't find anything that gave him any hints as to what happened to her. It was as if she had just vanished. But Dermot was closer than he could have imagined to uncovering the mystery. After coming up empty, Dermot turned his search to an area that had been untouched, the tough terrains of the mountains that surrounded the town. He was an experienced hiker, and he knew he could handle the difficult area and could get into places that others hadn't been able to. Even still, Dermot felt like it was a lost cause. If police helicopters and dogs had no luck finding the girl, how was he supposed to? But that didn't stop him. He couldn't just sit around. He needed to do something. Little did the hiker know he was about to solve the mystery of the missing girl. 7 months passed by, and there was still no update on Alice's mysterious disappearance. While some people moved on with their lives, Dermot wasn't willing to give up. Every time he went for a hike, he looked in new areas for the missing girl. Like every other day, Dermot put on his winter jacket, tied his hiking shoes, and headed out to the mountains to search for Alice. But this time wasn't like the other times. Things were about to change. Just under an hour of hiking had gone by, and Dermot began to sweat. The hike wasn't easy, and he could feel his muscles aching. Even still, he wasn't going to give up easily. He continued his hike, taking in the feel of the fresh air and the smell of the wild grass and oak trees surrounding him. When suddenly, he heard something unusual that completely caught him off guard. The hiker held his breath and tried to make out the weird sound. He heard a voice, but it was very quiet, and Dermot had no idea where the voice was coming from. Immediately, he thought of the missing girl, and he was filled with fear. "Alice!" Dermot shouted at the top of his lungs, but he heard nothing. Then, there was no voice at all. He couldn't help but wonder where the voice was coming from. Dermot continued his hike, but now he was more alert than ever. Was he hearing things? Was this all a joke? He started feeling sick. Dermot wanted to continue screaming out for Alice, but he was cautious because he didn't know if it was the right decision. He had no idea what he was getting into. And then he heard the same voice call out again. It sent shivers down his spine, but this time it was closer than before. Dermot was caught off guard once again. He slowed down his breathing to try and listen to where the sound was coming from. And then it stopped once again. His heart was beating a mile a minute, but he knew he needed to calm down and think clearly. Then, suddenly, he ran forward and saw something that looked out of place in the mountains. This sight stopped Dermot right in his tracks, and he had to take a closer look. Dermot stumbled upon a random pile of logs that looked completely out of place. What were they doing there? So, he walked toward them to get a better look. And when he finally reached them, he couldn't believe what he saw. Dermot was filled with every emotion possible. He wanted to run and scream for help. But who would hear him in this secluded part of the Maintains? He was far from civilization. The hiker knew he needed to act quickly. His hands were shaking, but he managed to pick up his phone and dial for help. He called 911. "Come quick, now, please!" he shouted into his phone at the top of his lunges, pleading for help. He had a gut feeling something wasn't right, but he had no idea what to do because he had never been in this type of situation before. As he waited for the cops to arrive, Dermot paced back and forth. Dermot didn't want to tamper with any evidence, so he waited to hear the voice again. He felt like he was close to solving the mystery of the missing girl. Every second and minute that passed by felt like an eternity to Dermot. And about 30 minutes after making the call, the police arrived. But they had no idea what to expect. "What exactly is going on here?" one officer asked in an authoritative tone. Dermot approached the officer with tears running down his face. "Just look over there," he said, barely able to get the words out of his mouth while pointing at the pile of logs. Bracing himself for the worst, the officer walked over to the pile of logs. He felt more uneasy with each step he took toward the log pile. He wasn't sure why, but he had a bad feeling about what he was about to find. And when the officer finally got close enough to get a good look at the logs, he saw what Dermot saw. Immediately, he felt very sick. From far away, the pile of logs looked like nothing more than a pile of logs. But upon closer look, the officer grew suspicious about the rectangular shape and the black lines. He knew something wasn't quite right. The logs were placed too perfectly. And as soon as the officer realized what the pile of logs actually was, he had a terrible feeling deep in the pit of his stomach. The black lines that looked oddly shaped weren't just lines. They turned out to be windows. And what the officer thought was a pile of logs ended up being a secret hideaway. They uncovered a secret cabin. When Dermot and the officer took a better look inside the secret cabin, they couldn't believe what they saw. They were not prepared for what was inside. It shook them to their core. Deep inside the secret cabin was a small living accommodation. And then suddenly, a girl emerged from the corner of the room. Dermot and the officer were so surprised that they gasped when seeing the girl. The officer took another look at the girl, and he knew exactly who she was. He was so shocked that he couldn't get any words out. And Dermot wasn't doing much better. He started crying. After 7 long months of no new discoveries and searches coming up empty, there was finally a break in the case of the missing 18-year-old girl. Alice was found, and more importantly, she was safe. The officer couldn't get over Dermot's persistence in finding the girl. But now that she was found, there was still one question that needed to be answered. What was Alice doing in the secret cabin? After finding Alice, the officer called for backup to get her to safety. But were they too late? Were they all in danger? Who did the secret cabin belong to? Now that the 18-year-old girl was found after all those months, there were lots of questions that still needed to be answered. And before long, more cops showed up to the cabin to get some much-needed answers. The cops brought Alice back to the police station to try and finally get some answers. The girl told officers that she had been kidnapped by a man, and he locked her away in the secret cabin for months. She had no idea 7 months has gone by. But as they tried to figure out what happened, they came up empty-handed. They had no leads in the case. Alice was returned home safely, and to this day, the case remains open. Children go missing every day, and more often than not, they don't return home safely. After Alice went missing, her community never gave up hope, and they continued the search for her until she was found. Alice is one of the lucky ones, and her story wouldn't have had a happy ending if it wasn't for the persistence of Dermot. Dermot is a real hero, and we wish Alice nothing but the best.